Great. Thank you so much. And just a preliminary shout out to the organizers of the conference and to our moderator and to all of you for being here. Thank you. I pulled a classic librarian trick and let y'all kind of get into this poll everywhere just to see where people are coming from. More Tennessee than anything, which I sort of expected. So thank you for participating. I will be using that same poll everywhere in just a little bit. So that was my trick to get you in there before we get started. Anyway, so let's get started. I am Ashley McGuire, as stated, and I'm really looking forward to talking with you about STEM undergraduate and graduate students today, which is a topic near and dear to my heart, as you will hear going forward. So first, I'm going to share why that's near and dear to my heart, just to give you a little perspective on what it is that I'm doing with STEM and why. I'm also going to sort of share with you some STEM student stereotypes and profiles and sort of get your feedback. This will be pretty interactive as we go, so please feel free to share in the chat at any point, but I will prompt that sharing here and there. I'm also going to talk about imposter syndrome, which is something I think all of us suffer from here and there, but as a STEM person, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about it from that perspective. And then I'm also going to spend some time talking about international student considerations, because a lot of the things that they struggle with are things all of us struggle with when it comes to learning information literacy, with just a little added complication. So we'll talk about that and then wrap up with some tools and activities that I recommend. So let's get it going. So first, my background, all right? Just so you know, full transparency, I am a former student, still type A, former gifted student. So I am very intense, hard on myself when it comes to my expectations for my own success and the work that I do. When I got to college, I learned what a first generation student is and then learned that I am one. So there are different definitions for that. I won't get deep into the weeds on that. There are some great papers if you want to read some reviews on the many definitions of first generation students. But that is just how I identify. I did manage to go to college and get my BS in chemistry with a minor in physics in 2011. I've always loved science. I thought I wanted to be a mathematician until I met chemistry, love at first sight. So I knew I wanted to be in chemistry. I knew I wanted to be in education of some kind. So I was on the path, right? So I went from my degree in chemistry, which I actually got from Austin Peay State University. Shout out to my Tennessee librarians up in Clarksville. Then I moved to Rhode Island and got a master's in chemistry. I was really, really underprepared. Yeah, let's go, P. I was really underprepared for grad school. The minor in physics helped boost me a little bit to prepare me for that. But things were going weird in my life. I actually got accepted to the PhD program, but then ended up finishing my master's and just needing to get out for a lot of reasons that we could talk about another time. But my plan short shifted unexpectedly. Luckily, I had a wonderful professor at URI, Dr. Kirkenbaum, who was a real champion of alternative careers for chemists. And he introduced me to the idea of becoming a librarian, which sounded like a fever dream. Like, what do you mean I can do science and be a librarian? Didn't know that was an option. So I went to get my MLIS, which is sort of what leads me here, right? Talking to you, a bunch of librarians today. And when I was getting my MLIS, Austin Peay actually asked me to come back and teach general chemistry as an adjunct professor. And so then I was stuck in a weird place, right? Like, I love science. I love teaching science. I love learning science. I love librarianship, but it's a hard market out there to teach when you don't have a PhD. And there just weren't any library positions in my area. Sorry, my phone was ringing. There weren't any library positions in my area at the time, and I wasn't ready yet to move where the jobs are, as you must do in academia sometimes. So I went back and got my PhD in chemistry. All of this to say, I've been a student for a really long time. I've known that my career was going to be teaching focused for a really long time. So I've done every level of the STEM student adventure. And luckily, my PhD was done after some library perspective, which really helped a lot. When I was finishing my dissertation at the University of Alabama, Tuscaloosa, one of my committee members was actually our chemistry librarian, Ben Scalfani, and he kept asking me like, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to teach? Are you going to go to the libraries? What's the plan? So I decided to try teaching my original plan and did get a tenure track job doing that for a couple of years, during which time I learned a lot about the scholarship of teaching and learning, which has become a real passion of mine. So all of that to say, I now find myself in a very privileged position at UAB as a science librarian with this wealth of background from the perspective of a STEM student, but also a STEM faculty member. And I think it really informs a lot of what I do. So let's talk now a little bit about stereotypes. Let me fix our situation here. Don't enter anything yet. Hold on. Let me clear the responses from our last thing and change this up to a text wall. All right, now, if you would, right, on that same poll everywhere, I can drop the link in again into the chat. Would you now enter some stereotypes that you know or have heard about STEM students of any level, right? Because how do we even know who they are? I hear feedback from many other STEM librarians that we don't really get to interact with science people a lot on campus. And that's not just students, that's faculty too, right? So who are they, right? What do they need from us? And why haven't I ever met them? Where are they, right? What are they doing? So yes, if y'all would keep putting in things, this looks great. I'm gonna swap this over so you can see your responses. All right. So again, the prompt is, what are some stereotypes you know about STEM students? And here's what we're seeing, right? Hopefully you can maybe see this on your devices too. Yeah, they're independent, right? They're smart, they're busy, a lot of lack of engagement. I can't say I disagree with that. That's the rumor, right? Big time nerds. I'm going to star that one because I'm a big time nerd. Shy, self-sufficient, good, can't write. As someone who teaches a graduate level engineering class now in writing, yeah, that is definitely a stereotype and possibly for a reason. Good. Thank you. Thank you for that feedback. Great. So let's get into some of these stereotypes. So STEM kids, STEM students, STEM people of any level tend to be thought of as very smart people, perhaps in a way that separates them from the rest of humanity in a way. I don't love that, but that's a stereotype. And really independent thinkers. We tend to think of them as extremely independent, right? So I wanted to highlight a couple of articles for you. They're fairly recent, just highlighting some of these STEM profiles, right? The first one I want to talk about is Rice et al., Rice, Lopez, and Richardson, talking about perfectionism among STEM students. So perfectionism, in the case of this paper by Rice, Lopez, and Richardson, they talk about how perfectionism, which is sort of hallmarked by extremely high self-imposed expectations and standards, they talk about how that is both reflected in conscientiousness of students, which is about their will to succeed, right, and their constraint. And also reflected potentially in neuroticism, which is sort of like the maladaptive version of perfectionism. So unrealistically high standards, excessively critical self-evaluation. And this article, honestly, reading all three of the articles I'm going to highlight for you was a lot for me in preparation for this today, because it's really weird to read journal articles about the person you were when you were 18. I don't know if I recommend it, but it was definitely enlightening. Anyways, these researchers, Rice, Lopez, and Richardson, found that among college STEM students, there are really three classes of student. There are adaptive perfectionists who are, I mean, yes, they have high standards for themselves, but they're really good at using that as a driver to motivate them and not really letting that get to a point where it's unhealthy. So they're adaptive. There are maladaptive perfectionists who are the ones who tend to be so critical that it prevents them from being as successful and growing as they could. And then there are just non-perfectionists. There are just people who don't suffer from perfectionism in science. Which I think is really interesting. They noted that the maladaptive perfectionists, specifically women who fall into that category in STEM, tend to have lower GPAs than the maladaptive perfectionist men, which I think is really interesting. And so there are potentially some sex differences that come with the maladaptive behavior and then their ability to get over those issues. That's a really interesting paper to read. The next paper I'd like to highlight is Lamb, Hostin, Lin, and Firestone, so Lamb et al. And it's about, they were looking at allostatic load. So allostatic load is basically when your daily stresses from a variety of things, it can be academic or social pressures or other things environmentally going on around you. It is when those things, to quote the authors, it's a subclinical state of dysregulation from your body's response to chronic pressures. So in other words, physiologically, you begin to react in unhealthy ways to this long-term stress load that you're carrying. The thing that I found really interesting about this paper, because it actually took me a while when I was reading it to realize this, is the research that they did in this paper is about high school STEM students, not even at the college or graduate level yet. So this is something that you can literally see in the physiological responses of students from very early on. Now, the students they studied were in a special STEM-focused school, so they were very STEM-focused, but the authors talked a lot about things we hear students really need, right? Perseverance, persistence, and grit, right? And so all about this ability to continue despite obstacles and your personal resolution to continue despite obstacles and this inner resolve, which leads to that allostatic stress because you don't want to give it up, right? And so I don't know. They did find that social pressures have a really, really large influence on this allostatic load for these high school students with or without academic pressures. And so that self-consciousness, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, really is a huge factor here in the stress load these students are carrying in their bodies. That increased allostatic load also really affects the cognitive resources that these students have to give to their studies, which is something I find really interesting. Yeah, Erin, I agree. The body keeps the score. The body knows, right? Even if you're somehow divorcing yourself from thinking about how stressful things are. Finally, Lee, Kirk, and Osaguera. This was a really interesting, very recent study where they studied over 600 college students, STEM students, and saw sort of what personality profiles they kind of fell into, or sorry, performance profiles they fell into through the course of their studies in STEM, so over a several year period instead of just looking at them as a snapshot at one time. And they found that these 600 plus students fell into four performance profiles. The best outcome is they're just stable high performers. They come in, these are undergraduates primarily, they come in, they perform well, they leave with a high GPA, fine, right? Women tend to fall into that category and into the next category, slightly improving moderate performers. But they did notice that the underrepresented minorities tend to be underrepresented in stable high performers, which again, I'll get into in a little bit. The other two categories are stable low performers. So they come in and they stay consistent throughout, but they never really get to the high achieving point, which a lot of STEM students feel really driven about, right? Getting a high GPA. And then finally, we have the fourth category, which is sharply declining low performers. And in these bottom two categories, the authors here found that male students and underrepresented minorities are really overrepresented. And so is there some kind of stigma? I would argue, this is me extrapolating, that these are maybe the student bodies who hesitate the most in seeking help from someone external, right? They also found that these science students, these are all STEM identified students, they all came in with fairly comparable GPA and SAT numbers from high school. And so they just want to reinforce that those are not necessarily indicators of performance at the college level. All right, so this time in the chat, right? No, we'll do that in a minute. Anyway, we already did this part. So what have you heard? We talked about that already, right? Some of the stereotypes we've heard. One of the things is STEM students don't use the library. They don't ever go to the library, right? They spend all their time in lab, etc., right? I would argue another real big stereotype is that the STEM faculty don't have time for us. And I really appreciate, for those of you who got to see Casey and Sarah present in the last session, before this one, they talked about this too, right? Like there's not a lot of class time, and in science classes in particular, there's so much content we have to move through that it's really hard to give a class period or half an hour of class time to the libraries, especially when you don't necessarily have assignments that are really well tooled for interacting with library tools. And then finally, they don't need our help. They're self-sufficient, they're smart kids, they'll figure it out, they don't need our help, right? And I would argue that none of these things are true, and they certainly don't have to be true, though the STEM faculty do take a little convincing sometimes. So, all right, this time in the chat, right? Let's talk about imposter syndrome. And I am pretty confident when I say most, if not all of us, have experienced this at some point. But if you don't mind in the chat, right, what is your experience with imposter syndrome? Have you felt it? What do you think about imposter syndrome? Do you think students are struggling with that? Are there some people who are more susceptible than others? Yes, Corey said, feel it vividly in every cell in my body. Same, yeah, yep. If a PhD taught me anything, it's that I don't know anything. Kylie says, in my experience, students definitely struggle with it. Fake it till you make it. That's literally the advice I was given when I started my PhD program. We did a training to learn how to be TAs in labs and things, and that was the theme of the day. I think I heard that advice 1,000 times that day. Fake it till you make it. Okay. Erin said, being a first-gen student gave me and continues to give me imposter syndrome. I definitely feel that. I mentioned earlier that I identify as first generation. My parents, neither of them have a 4-year degree, so that's the definition I'm going with. Other people in my family, including my grandmother and my grandfather, had a 4-year degree, which is why I said it depends on your definition. But as far as graduate school, me entering grad school not only once, but more than once, totally unheard of in my family. So I definitely get that. Kelly said, I never feel qualified to speak up anywhere, even when I know that I objectively am. Yeah, I totally get that. And imposter syndrome, it's complicated by other factors we also have no control over, like culture and stereotypes about other facets of our identities, and it's really complicated, but it's also really universal, which I find really comforting in a way. We're all imposters together. All right, so, oh yeah, neurodivergence contributes heavily to my imposter syndrome. Totally same, agree. So I just want to give a little background. I pulled this information from Psychology Today. Appreciate you, Psychology Today. So as far as causes, it's largely a personality thing, which is kind of unfortunate because we are who we are, right? So there's that. I think therapy could help, but anyway, that's not what I'm here to talk about. Perfectionism, again, neuroticism, self-efficacy, a lot of the factors that I talked about in that paper from Rice et al. Really go hand in hand with feeling imposter syndrome. It can be exacerbated by competitive environments, which if you've met a STEM student or ever been one, okay, especially those who are pre-meds perhaps or pre-health of some kind, very highly competitive. And so based on this, and again, this is just my opinion, I'm extrapolating, I would argue that STEM students in particular are extremely vulnerable to imposter syndrome. The prevalence is high, right? 25 to 30% of high achievers, define that how you will, probably experience imposter syndrome, and up to 70% of adults may experience within their lifetime. I think that's being phrased really gently. Even in library land where I work now, I would argue that it's closer to 100% experience it within the week at any given time. But again, that's just me. That's just personal observation. It also tends to be more prevalent in women and specifically women of color. And so these intersections of identities that historically maybe have not been given the ability to speak in a room, right, which is a historical problem in STEM, that can lead to further exacerbating imposter syndrome or making it more likely. Let's talk about some fears, right? So if we have students dealing with these things, what is it that they're internalizing, even if they don't realize they are? First, that they're undeserving of their achievements and the high esteem of others. And again, this is me being very personal with you. It took me a long time to get past feeling this way. So even these students who are making super high GPAs and they're getting internships and they're doing undergrad research and all this other stuff, they don't really believe that that's because they're doing anything right, right? So even when things look good, there's this deep insecurity. Lacking competence or intelligence assumed by others, right? Yeah, I'm in grad school. Yeah, I'm in a PhD program. Sure, I've got a good GPA. Yeah, I'm presenting at conferences, but they're going to know, right? People are about to realize that I faked it till I made it and I don't actually know anything and I'm not qualified to be here. Like that fear is intense. Sorry if I'm triggering anybody. Impending doom when the truth is revealed. Like I said, like the truth is going to come out that I don't know anything, that I don't belong in this room full of really, really smart people. And then what? Like my whole life is over, my career is over, like I'm going to be outed as a fraud. That's a lot. And again, these are things that don't just start in grad school or in undergrad. Like high achieving high schoolers feel this way. Like this is a much more global issue, I think, than a lot of people know. So just keep this in mind, I guess, when you're interacting with students, that even the ones doing the greatest achieving, like that doesn't mean that they feel secure in what they're doing. All right. So let me talk now about international students, right? And in the chat, please, I'd love you to chime in. How do you think international student needs differ from domestic student needs? And I am sort of specifically talking about STEM students, but international in general, right? Like, what are some extra things that we maybe need to consider when we're working with international students? And while you do that, I'll give you a little background. So here at UAB, we have a pretty large population of international students and international faculty and staff. Our percentage for international faculty and staff is between 4.5% and 5% as of fall 2024 or 2023. As of fall 2024, 2.4% of our undergrads and almost 20% of our grad students are international. That's about 9% overall of our student body. All right, getting some responses. So terminology is definitely something we need to think about. That translation, language barriers add challenges, different cultural norms, including about intellectual property, absolutely. Their previous library and educational experiences may be wildly different from what a domestic student experiences. That's absolutely true. I can't tell you how many times I've been asked by an international student, like, that's free? Like, I can just come and check out a book for nothing? Like, yeah, you sure can. And I hope you do. Yep. So a little bit of background. Here at UAB, we have INTO, which is an international scholar program to help students transition into studying in the States. They live in the same building as me, which is sort of nice. So they started a new class last fall called International Student Success. It's graduate and undergrad co-listed. And they asked me and a couple of other librarians to come in and talk to their students about library resources and whatnot, because most of those students were STEM students, or represented in business or nursing or some of the other programs they asked us to come talk about. And so not only do I care a lot about STEM students, but considering how many of those STEM students are international students, it is impossible for me to separate those two issues. And universal design for learning tells us that anything I do to help the international students is also going to help other students. So it's worth aiming for the most challenging problems we can solve, because that ends up helping everybody. All right, so just to pull some statistics on you, right? As of 2025, June was the most recent data that's been published. This is what international student population in the United States looks like. So more than 5% of all students in higher education, keeping in mind most students in higher education are at the bachelor's degree, but they haven't received their bachelor's yet. But at the graduate level, 27% of students, more than a quarter of students at the graduate level in the US right now are international students. I do have a little asterisk next to the undocumented students number, because if you go to the Higher Ed Immigration Portal website, that number is actually a little bit higher than the number that's in their June 10th data. And I imagine that has to do with things going on politically in the US right now. I'm not going to get deep into that. That is definitely an offline conversation. But anyway, as you can see, there are a lot of students in higher ed, 19.5 million in the United States, and about 10% of them are first-generation immigrant students, right? Second-generation immigrant students would be their parents immigrated here, and now they're attending U.S. schools, and there's quite a few of those. And then international students would be ones who truly, just came here for school, right? All right. Now, I wanted to take a look at the percentage of students, specifically graduate students here, because again, many more graduate students are international percentage-wise than undergraduate students. But I wanted to take a look at the National Center for Science and Engineering statistics for current data on this. The most recent data they have is from fall 2023. And in fall 2023, 39.1% of all graduate students in science, any science category, were international students. And this is full-time students. In engineering, it's 52.5%. More than half of all engineering graduate students in the United States are international students. And I'm going to pause for dramatic effect, because that number really surprised me. More than half. That's huge. I wanted to break that down a little bit into sort of like the top 5 fields. So this data, which is wonderful, kind of breaks it down into individual fields or tracks, right? And so when it comes to science fields, these are the top 5, right? And I sort of italicized ones that are higher than 50%. But even, yeah, wow with all caps is exactly what I was going for. Even agricultural and veterinary science, which is not a huge population of students because there aren't that many veterinary programs necessarily, but still over a third of those students in our country are international students. And you're talking about, that's a medical program, well, the veterinary side is, maybe not agriculture, but you talk about highly technical language and really challenging coursework. The physical sciences sort of all get lumped together. That could be anything, chemistry, physics, similar things. Over 40%. Multi-interdisciplinary sciences, there is no better definition of that, but especially when it comes to mathematics and statistics and computer and information sciences, over half, 65.3% of all graduate students in computer and information science are international students, right? And so when it comes to helping these scholars, obviously we have large motivation to be paying attention to the international student needs. All right. Oh, I don't know why the font on that first one was so much bigger, but okay. So for engineering, here's our top 5. I wanted to include everything above the 1/3 mark, but honestly, there were so many of them, I just did the top 5. So these are the ones that are above 50% on this list, right? So maybe unsurprisingly, since we just saw science and computer science was at the top of that list, electrical, electronics, communications, and computer engineering, almost 65% of those students are international, right? And then in the 50 to 55 range, we have civil, environmental, transportation, and other related engineering programs, chemical, petroleum, and chemical related programs, industrial, manufacturing, and systems engineering and operations research, and then other engineering, whatever that means. Broad topic. A huge number of international students are coming to our universities to study these things. And some stay here, but a lot of people also take that experience back to their own countries to try to make the world a better place. So hopefully this is motivating you, right? I hope you feel motivated. Because again, universal design for learning tells us that anything we do to support these students, these STEM students, is going to also support students who have less high needs, right? And so this has really become sort of a focal point for a lot of what I'm doing right now. I'm actually in the middle of co-writing a chapter for an upcoming ACRL book on first-generation student support, where we're specifically looking at first-generation international students. So I'm really excited about that. But if you ever want to talk about this, feel free to email me. I would love to chat. All right. Anywho. Now that we're feeling motivated, I would love to share with you some of the tools and activities that I use, and then I'd like to hear about some of yours. So first, I want to talk to you about databases and search engines, right? So this is a really classic topic that I'm sure many of us talk about in our information literacy sessions, right? What is the difference, right? What do you use when? What do you never use? And so I'm going to share with you the version of this story that I tell my students, and then you can give me feedback if this makes sense or if I should tweak it, okay? So I like to tell my students, right? First I ask them, where do you go for information? Don't lie to me. Be honest. It's okay. Then, of course, my especially domestic students say Google, right? And I'm like, okay, cool. What is Google, right? And usually one person in the room is like, search engine. And I'm like, okay, great, cool. let's talk about what a search engine is versus what a database is, because I'm going to give you databases to use, right? So anyway, I tell them a database is like a box. Every database is a different box, and each of those boxes contains different things, right? We have boxes that contain just engineering papers. We have boxes that contain ebooks. We have boxes that contain films or pictures. We have boxes that are just about art, right? And we have a lot of boxes. We have a whole lot of boxes. And so my job as a librarian is to help you find the box that will hold the thing that you need to do the work you're doing. And I don't expect you to be an expert in finding that box. That's what I'm here for. And your faculty also ask me for help doing that. And so it's okay. Now, what is a search engine? A search engine is not a database. It's not a box. It's not one box. I like to think of a search engine as something that looks over the surface of all of these boxes and sort of gives you a glance into what some of those options might be, but the actual items that you find are held in other boxes. So that's my database versus search engine in a nutshell. And I think that really helps them understand, like, because I tell them, like, the stereotype is, I'm going to tell you to never use Google, right? I'm not going to tell you that. There are actually some Google tools that I find really useful in my personal life, so I would be a hypocrite to say not to do that. So we talk about Google Scholar and how that sort of looks across the surface of all these boxes for these papers, right? And then if you want to find that paper, maybe you go to the database, the correct box, and then grab the paper, etc., right? I also Google Patents, by the way. If you ever have to work with patents, I really enjoy using Google Patents. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So that's how I explain databases versus search engines. And I think that's really useful to break it down into really simple terms. And again, especially for international students who maybe have a limited technical vocabulary. Yes. Kylie, I really stress that the professors also ask me for help. A few of them do. I may exaggerate how many, but it normalizes that, right? These students don't really understand what it is to be their professor. Obviously, they haven't gotten there yet. And so again, that really helps smooth over these imposter syndrome feelings like, oh, you're saying I can ask for help, but like, I can't ask for help because no one else is going to ask you for help. No, people ask me for help all the time. That's my job. That's why I exist. And if people didn't need help, they wouldn't pay me to do what I'm doing. Yeah. Great. One of the major topics that I get asked, especially to talk to the international students, is about citations and plagiarism. As was mentioned earlier, cultural feelings about citations and plagiarism and what's appropriate and what's not can be really different. And especially our large number of international students who are coming here for grad school as their first time in the States, that can be a really, really big leap for them. And so we go through some of the typical topics, right? Like, why do we cite? And the anatomy of a citation. Like, all citations are basically the same, all the styles. They just put things in different orders and maybe abbreviate differently or capitalize differently. We talk about unintentional plagiarism, right? Which is a big one for the international students because there's a lot of, again, fear and guilt and especially the potential to go to plagiarism prison, as I like to call it. I like to ask them, like, what is the punishment for missing a citation or doing it incorrectly? Like, what is going to happen to you if you accidentally plagiarize something? And there's real fear there, like, especially for international students. Like, if that turns into an accusation of academic dishonesty, and then you could get literally sent back to your home country and you're out all this money, like, it's intense for them. And so I really like to reframe that for them. And I'll share sort of how I reframe that. Especially with the international students, I like to talk to them about the why we cite. It's not just because someone told us to and we're afraid of getting in trouble, right? And I think this really helps the science students especially, because I like to share with them that we cite because we are participating in a global conversation. Not just global, but temporally global. Like, it's happening over many, many years. It's happening over generations, outside of our lifetime. It's happening all over the world. Also on the International Space Station. Who knows what will come in the future, but like, it's a conversation we have to be having with each other so that everyone gets to progress technologically. And so we cite to connect what we're saying to the words other people have said and the ideas other people have shared, right? Otherwise, we might as well be running a blog and just screaming into the void, right? If you're not connecting those ideas to other people's ideas, then it harms your credibility. It makes it look like you're just spouting nonsense that isn't based on anything. And so even if your ideas are concrete and credible and based on good science, if you're not tying it into the ideas and the larger theories and the current global communication about that topic, then it's probably not going to have the effect that we need it to have for us to progress as a species, right? And so I find that that really bolsters the sense of confidence, which is helpful for them. I also like to share free tools that work and the ones that don't, right? As librarians, we know that if the metadata is not good, a citation website that will spit out a citation for you is never going to do a good job, right? And so I like to talk to them, about reference management software versus like plugging it into the citation machine or whatever. Don't do that. But anywho, ultimately, I really use this conversation to give them this sense of ownership and belonging, right? You are a scientist, and I want you to be able to participate in this conversation. And so that's why we must engage in these activities, right? We need to add ourselves to the network of thinkers so that we can all work together to solve problems. And I find that the STEM students really respond well to that. So in summary, I will wrap up and then we can talk some more about things. Susan, by the way, mentioned that she likes to compare databases to streaming services, and it helps students understand that some resources live in only one service while others live in multiple services. That's really smart, and I might borrow that idea for the next time I teach information instruction. So thank you for that, Susan. Right, so in summary, STEM students struggle with the same issues as any other young scholar, plus a higher prevalence of this perfectionism and neuroticism and imposter syndrome and this sort of erosion of self-confidence. Many of them, not all of them, but many of them do. And it can be a really silent struggle because outwardly and GPA-wise, they can seem like they're doing very well, right? But as a student who took organic chemistry and physics at the same time and quickly learned that I actually don't know everything and I also don't know how to study and then proceeded to panic, everybody hits a wall eventually. Well, almost everybody hits a wall eventually and has to learn the hard way that we're not invincible or geniuses. Not everybody. Anyway, for a lot of students, these feelings never really lessen or go away, especially as you progress through your science degrees, right? In fact, they probably compound because, like, how did I get into this grad school? People are going to realize I don't know what I'm doing. How did I get this postdoc position? People are going to realize I don't know what I'm doing. International students, again, I would argue are particularly vulnerable and highly represented among STEM graduate programs. Less so undergraduate programs, but they're still there. But again, anything we create that supports our international STEM students supports all of our students. Also, footnote, please check on your postdocs and your faculty members too, because like we're all struggling. And then finally, I want to wrap up with a little advice. First, describe the tools you recommend and the rules and scenarios for using them. STEM students, this is generalizing, but we tend to be very rules-oriented, right? Steps-oriented. And so that really helps students understand when certain tools are appropriate. Normalize asking for assistance. Like I mentioned earlier, I love to tell my students that their professor or other professors also email me to ask for advice. Because that's true. It should be what people are doing, and it's what we're trained for to support you in your educational journey and endeavors. Be specific about what you can offer, or if there are things you cannot offer. For example, for graduate students, I am super happy to sit down with you and help you develop a really sophisticated search strategy for your lit review. I am not going to do that search for you and compile that information on your behalf. You're writing a dissertation. Enthusiasm goes a long way. I love teaching. I love science. I love working with students. I feel extremely privileged to do the job that I'm doing. And I think students catch that vibe, right? And so I really try hard to go out of my way to be super friendly. I try to have a cozy office. I usually have like trail mix or snacks in my office in case they're hungry. You can't think when you're hungry. But just those little things, just like smiling when you see them or like, whatnot, that really makes a difference and makes you feel approachable. And that's something that they can really struggle with. And finally, I really hope that you will join me in inspiring these students to engage with the global conversation happening in their fields, right? It's important for the betterment of our world, for the continuation of our species. And so if anything you take away from this, I hope that that is something you take away. And finally, I'd like to thank you and invite any questions or comments. Kelly said she compares databases to stores in the mall, which only works because there's still a good mall in our town. Fair. I don't know for international students if that would translate though, but I do like that. As a millennial, I grew up in malls. Oh, nice. Martha says she does that too. She talks about how some sell everything and some sell only a very specialized kind of product, like the kiosk that only has sunglasses. I added the sunglasses bit. You're welcome, Robin. Yeah, please. Any feedback? Ooh, Casey said her co-presenter, Sarah, co-presenter from the last session, compares databases to a bowl of Halloween candy. That sounds delicious, and Halloween's my favorite holiday, so I would love to hear her spiel. Yeah. She should compare it to the Halloween candy aisle at the grocery store. Yeah, that's fair. I think that's really similar to the streaming services one, right? Like some bags of candy have a combination of candies. Some bags of candy are only Hershey's, right? Audrey said she used to work with a colleague. Oh, I'm assuming genders. I apologize for that. Audrey said they used to work with a colleague who liked to tell students that academic search was like the Walmart of databases. I feel that. Also kind of Scopus, while others were specialty stores. That's a good one. Oh, thanks, Casey. Cool. All right. How many of us in the room are STEM librarians? I'm just curious. I see one. Right. Yes, I know some of us are everything librarians too. Right, among many other things. That's great. Well, I really enjoyed spending this time with all of you. And if you ever want to chat or collaborate, or hopefully we'll see each other at a future event. But yeah, please feel free to email me. And if you know any Austin Peay librarians, tell them I said hi. That's where I did my practicum in library school as well.